here's some things I think don't exist. So if you're going to predict anything in the real world, here's some things not to use. I don't think self-esteem exists. I think there were, 25,000 published papers on self-esteem. Figure 10 grand a paper, which is, a comparatively conservative estimation. So you can do the math, 25,000 times 10,000. So that's the total amount of research funding that's gone into looking at self-esteem. It's like, well, what's self-esteem? It's a word. Actually, it's two words, right? But, and it's sort of something you think you might have or not have, but that's a figure of speech. That's not an empirical phenomena. And so most of extroversion is just neuroticism, as it turns out. It's like if you have a lot of negative emotion, you don't feel that good about yourself. Well, isn't that a surprise? You have a lot of negative emotion. And if you want to fix it up a little bit, then you can also subtract positive emotion from that, because if you have a lot of negative emotion and you don't have a lot of positive emotion, so that's neuroticism minus extroversion, then your self-esteem is even lower. And then maybe over time, conscientiousness starts to make a bit of a difference, right? Because if you're conscientious and you work hard, you can start to see that that's paying off, and Taffarotti's done some work that seems to sort of indicate that. But, the first thing that happened is everybody went on a self-esteem bender, even though the measures were pretty appalling, and even though you could, model it with the big five. And then one of the things that happened as a consequence of that was that the whole California school system started to teach students self-esteem. It's like, what makes you think you should have high self-esteem? Like maybe you're a miserable little worm. God only knows, right? It's not the case that you should have a good opinion of yourself in every bloody situation. What if you're a bully who pounds people out in the schoolyard? Bullies, by the way, do have higher self-esteem than normal. So because it's not like they're feeling bad about themselves when they pound you, they're feeling bad about you. And the best work, the low self-esteem equals bully hypothesis, lots of people believe that. But if you read Dan Olweus, who's the world's leading authority on bullying and who's actually done something about it, what he says is that bullies have inappropriately high self-esteem, which is why they think they're in a perfectly good position to pound you out if you happen to be on the playground. So it's not like they're suffering from a, neurotic weakness of self-image. It's quite the contrary. So, anyways, in the California school system, they tried to teach kids self-esteem. And, there's no evidence that you can do that first, because neuroticism is actually quite hard to shift. So, and if we knew how to treat it, well, hooray, everybody would be thrilled about that, but it's not easy. And second, there are people like Jean Twenge, who used to be a student of Roy Baumeister's, who claims that all that self-esteem training has just, made younger people like you guys more narcissistic. Yeah, because the self-esteem becomes disconnected from the actual accomplishment, because you might hope, well, you'd sort of feel good. How good should you feel about yourself? Well, you might say, well, you should grant yourself the right to exist like you do everyone else. That's sort of like a basic human right. As a human being, you're valuable. And then maybe you should sort of think you're about as valuable as other people roughly think you are. That seems about right? So the right amount of self-esteem would be your perception of your value within the context of a group. It's got to be something like that. So there should be a concordance, because like maybe you need to improve. Could well be, And are you going to improve if you're feeling really good about yourself? Well, the answer to that is, well, we don't know. How much misery about yourself do you have to have before you're motivated to improve yourself? None? Well, that doesn't seem right, but we also don't know whether it's shame or guilt or anxiety or pain or, these negative emotions that motivate you. Now, it's clear that if you have enough negative emotion, that can paralyze you. But that's like depression and psychiatrically high levels of anxiety. That's not like low self-esteem. So that's a problem. I don't believe that working memory and executive function are distinguishable from IQ, especially G. Our research, we've done a lot of it. I've factor analyzed a battery of 10 dorsolateral prefrontal tests given to 3,000 people. It's a very big sample. We haven't published this for a variety of reasons, but one factor comes out. And Carroll's rule for IQ was you take cognitive tests, a bunch of them, you factor analyze them, you pull out the first factor, that's fluid intelligence. It's like, well, that's basically what we found. And so if you look at the correlation between each of the single tests and the first factor, it's only about 0.3 or 0.4. But that's also what you find in IQ tests. each individual test only correlates with the aggregate at about 0.3. But if you aggregate enough of them, you get fluid intelligence, and it's just as solid as a rock. So, emotional intelligence, not only does that probably not exist because it's agreeableness, you know how you always hear you need emotional intelligence to thrive in the workplace? It's like, turns out that's exactly backwards. Disagreeable people do better as managers in the workplace. So it's actually, if you lack emotional intelligence, you're more likely to be an effective manager. So an emotional intelligence is a great, indicator of sort of pathology and psychology because it was invented by a journalist. You can't just have some word invented by a journalist and then go make a whole bloody, enterprise out of it. You got to find out if it's really there. And there's not a lot of evidence that it is. And what does it mean anyways? Emotional intelligence. What does that mean? I can infer what you're feeling? Well, is that IQ? Like, are smart people better at that? Or like, am I mirroring you in some way? Or do I care for you? Like, maybe I can figure out exactly what you're feeling and I just don't give a damn. Is that still emotional intelligence? Well, I don't know, right? How would you separate that from sympathy or empathy? And what if you're oversympathetic to someone? Is that emotional intelligence? Like, maybe you feel way too sorry for your children. So it's like you're all empathetic and all that, but you're not doing them any good. Or sometimes you would be, but sometimes you should say, quit whining, go the hell outside. Because that's the right response sometimes. So these things are not straightforward at all. And of course, emotional intelligence is generally measured with questionnaires. And we know the rule for questionnaires. What's the rule for questionnaires? It's measuring one or more of the big five, either well or badly. Okay. So, and as far as I can tell, that doesn't mean that personality has a 5-dimensional structure. I'm not making that argument, because who the hell knows? I don't think it does, likely, although it's very difficult to say. But what the big five theorists have really demonstrated, as far as I'm concerned, is that if you factor analyze questionnaires, what you get looks a lot like a 5-factor structure, and you can do that cross-culturally. And so I think we sort of nailed the question of how are questionnaires structured. So you can't just invent some new thing and term it something, and then pretend it's something new without testing it against. And I would test it against IQ, because that bloody thing. We know, for example, IQ eats up most of the variance in disgust sensitivity scales. You'd think, well, why would IQ be related to disgust sensitivity? It's inversely related, by the way. The smarter you are, the less sensitive you are to disgust. Now, I don't know if that's because maybe your cortical inhibition of underlying, like, limbic motivational systems is better. Who the hell knows? We don't know why, but we do know that it's a major predictor. Orderliness also predicts. But the thing about IQ is that it predicts things that you'd never expect. So you should validate your scale against IQ and against the big five, and not some trivial little 10-item measure of the big five either. Because then, if you use 2 questions per trait, you're going to have a lousy measure of the big five. And if your stupid questionnaire predicts over and above that, all that means is that you didn't test it against, you didn't set it up for a good challenge. You set it up for a weak challenge. There's a problem with the measurement of self-esteem. And that actually matters because self-esteem is a psychological concept, a scientific concept, if you like, and you have to get the measurement right. And you can predict self-esteem almost perfectly by measuring someone's extroversion and subtracting from that their negative emotionality or neuroticism. So it's actually just a combination of big five traits. And so people who are extroverted, who feel a lot of positive emotion, and who don't feel a lot of negative emotion, score high on scales of self-esteem. Okay, so conceptually, it's a non-starter, because you're not going to move people's levels of neuroticism, let's say, by trying to get them to feel good about themselves. Okay, now, having said that, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't encourage people, right? Now, there's this psychologist named Jerome Kagan, who's quite a great psychologist, developmental psychologist. I think he's an emeritus at Harvard at the moment. He studied temperamentally inhibited children. So they're basically kids who are high in neuroticism, probably low in extroversion. And he found that if those children, and you can identify them as early as 6 months, right? It's very, very inculcated in their temperament. He found that if you encouraged them in the world, you could shift them into a more stable personality configuration.
And what you basically did was, when they were manifesting signs of distress, instead of encouraging them to withdraw and retreat, which is what they might be attempting to do, you encourage them to go out and explore. So, for example, if you have a temperamentally inhibited child and you go to a playground and there's kids out there, like if you have an extroverted, emotionally stable kid, 3 years old, as you put them on the ground, their feet are already moving, right, like a puppy over water, and you let them go and they just run to the kids, and they're there, and then you have to drag them away. But if you have a temperamentally inhibited child, the child will sort of stand around your legs and sort of peek out, you know. And then what you do is wait it out, let them watch, encourage them to move a little bit forward, encourage them to take their steps out into the unknown and the strange land, and don't let them withdraw. Like, you can do it. They're slower to warm up. They'll warm up. They'll habituate. And if you continually expose your inhibited child to the things that make them anxious in measured doses, then you can transform their psychophysiological temperament. Now, you're probably not going to shift them way the hell out onto the extroverted, emotionally stable end, but you can make a big difference. That's very different than making them feel good about themselves, which is such a... You need to curse. You need to curse when you discuss that concept, right? So it isn't improve their self-esteem. It isn't how you feel about yourself, right? It's how you act effectively in the world and how you're trained to do that. So, okay, now, then you were talking about negotiation, right? And you said, well, you said something like, don't people who feel good about themselves, aren't they able to negotiate better? And I know that's a poor paraphrase, excuse me, but negotiation is actually a practical issue to some degree. Like, the first thing is that you have to figure out what you want. Because you were saying, well, it's not merely rational. It's like, yeah, that's for sure. You have to bargain from a position of authority, let's say, not power. Authority is a better word. But you don't have authority unless you know what you're talking about, and unless you can bring some, let's say, force. That's not the right word. You can't negotiate with anyone unless you can say no. And you can't say no unless you've set yourself up with alternatives. So when you go to your boss and you negotiate for a raise, you need to have the sort of CV that enables you to go find another job. And you have to have your CV prepared. And you have to have looked for another job. And you have to be able to get one. Because then you can go in there and say, I'm not as productive as I could be at my current level of remuneration. It's not reflective of what I'm able to do. And I want this, and this is what will happen. If you give me this, this will be the good things that will happen. And what do you think of that? And the person is going to know, even by the way that you hold yourself while you're having the discussion, whether or not you're someone with options. And you can't fake that. Well, you can, but it's not helpful. Like, it just doesn't work for very many iterations. You have to, it's not rational. You're preparing yourself for battle. That's what you're doing. And you can't be weak when you prepare yourself for battle. Because if the person says, no, I'm not giving you a raise, which is exactly what they should say, because what are they going to do? Just like sprinkle the money around? You need to be able to say, okay then, there will be consequences that you don't like. And that's what it means to say no to someone. No means, if you continue to push this, things will happen that you don't like. Now in that case, it'll be, I'll depart and take my talents with me. And if they don't care, well then you're in the wrong business, or you don't have any talents to begin with, right? Which is, so in order to negotiate properly, and this is more difficult for people who are agreeable, for example, and because they tend to be more conflict averse, you have to put yourself in a position where you can push back as hard as you're going to be pushed on. And that means you have to open up your space of available options, because otherwise the person says no and that's it. You're done. Well, you'll lose then. It's as straightforward as that. Now, with regards to the self-esteem part, is practice on small things. Because you build the skills. Forget about the self-esteem. It isn't about being confident or feeling confident or any of that. It's about knowing bloody well how to negotiate. Start with small things, you know. So you'll notice that there are things in your relationships in particular that aren't the way you want them to be, and that you could see how could be improved. It's like, figure out how they can be improved, negotiate with your partner, make the incremental improvement. Keep doing that. You'll get better and better at it. And then you'll be able to go out and have a harder negotiation in the world. So it's a set of skills. There's an attitude behind it, you know, and it's easier for some people than others. But fundamentally, it's a set of skills. So then the question came to me, do I believe in God? And I don't like that question. And people have complained at me a lot, and I'm sure they have their reasons because they don't like my answers, and I have two answers. They've kind of become stock, which is not a good thing. But they're the best approximate. I can't figure out why I don't like the question exactly. I had three sort of burgeoning hypotheses. One was, it's none of your damn business. That's the first one. So it's like a privacy issue. Like, it seemed to me to be a question that was too private to be answered properly. And so, you could consider that a cop-out, and maybe it is. And then another one was, well, what do you mean by believe? Like, do you mean the words? Do you mean to say the words, I believe in God? Does that indicate that you believe in God? Like, I don't know what you mean by believe exactly, and that's got me in trouble too, because, people think that attempting to clarify the meaning of words is an attempt to escape from the question when it's actually an attempt to specify the question. I mean, is what you believe what you say or what you act out? Now, I would say to some degree it's both, but if push comes to shove, as far as I'm concerned, what you believe is what you act out, not what you say. And, and if you're an integrated person, then what you act out and what you say are the same thing, and then you're a person whose word can be trusted, right? Because what you say and what you do are isomorphic. They're the same thing. But belief is instantiated in action. So I have also suggested that I act as if I believe in God, or to the best of my ability. And people aren't very happy with that either. And then the third is that I'm afraid that he might exist, which I think is the most comical of the three answers and perhaps the most accurate one. But then I was thinking about this today when I was thinking about what I might talk to you guys about. And I thought, well, let's go into this a little bit more. Let's say you do believe in God. Say, I believe in God. It's like, okay, well, that's hypothetically pretty impressive, I would say. It's like you believe that there's a divine power that oversees everything, that is fundamentally ethical, that's watching everything you do, and you believe that. And so what effect does that have on your behavior if you believe it? Are you all in on your beliefs? Are you sacrificing everything to this transcendent entity that you proclaim belief in? Have you cleansed yourself of all your sin, let's say? Are you making all the sacrifices that you need to make? Like, have you taken the mote out of your eye? Or are you in the same situation, let's say, that the Catholic Church seems to be in right now? Just out of curiosity, it's a good time to bring that up, since the Pope seems to be concerned with what's been happening with the Catholic Church, given the endless pedophilic scandals, let's say, which seem rather serious in my estimation, and might have been something that was cleaned up perhaps 100 or 1,000 years ago. And it's being taken seriously perhaps now, and perhaps not, because it's not so easy to determine exactly what it would mean to take that seriously. And you might say, well, are all the people who are committing these heinous actions and then covering them up, if you ask them, well, do you believe in God? What are they going to say? Well, you'd think the answer would be yes, given that they're like priests. And yet, what's the evidence? Well, the evidence isn't exactly so clear that the mere statement, let's say, or the mere acting out of the ritual, let's say, and I'm not trying to denigrate the statement or the ritual, but I'm pointing out that that's no indication of you're right to say that you believe. Because you got it, and I think this is why it's bothered me to answer this question. It's like, well, what right do I have to say that, to make that claim? I believe in God. Well, what's the claim? Is that the claim that I'm a good person somehow? Because you'd think that if you believed in God, actually, like seriously, that you'd be a good person, like right now. Because, well, for obvious reasons, I would think. And so if that hasn't happened in some sort of miraculous sense, so that you're the best person you could possibly imagine being on an ongoing basis, and then terrified of of deviating from that path in a serious manner, then I don't see why you have the right to say that you believe in God. You know, one of the things Nietzsche said about Christianity, he was a great critic of Christianity, although also a great friend in a very peculiar way, in that sometimes your best friend is the one who points out your weakest properties, let's say. He said, as far as he was concerned, there was only one Christian, and he died on the cross. And that's a, you know, perhaps an extreme statement, but one worth giving some consideration to. It's like, well, then you look at what are you called upon? Let's say if you're going to proclaim yourself as a believer, you know. And I thought about this a lot as I've gone through the Old Testament. I did a bunch of lectures last year, and so what are you called upon? Well, you're called upon initially to act out the spark of divinity that's within you by confronting potential with the logos that's within you, which means to take the opportunities that are in front of you, the potential future, and to transform it into the present in the best possible way, using truth and courage and careful articulation as your guide. So that's the first thing you're called on to do. That's a major deal there. That's a tough one. And then the second is to make the proper sacrifices. That's the Cain and Abel story. Is like you want something, you genuinely want it, you want to set the world straight, then you let go of what's necessary and you pursue. You let go of what isn't necessary, no matter what it is. No matter what it is. And then you pursue what's necessary. And then maybe you sacrifice your children to God. That was the story. That's one of the next stories that comes up, of course. And you think, well, that's pretty damn barbaric. And the way the story's laid out, of course it is. But that isn't exactly what it means. It means that what you try to do when you raise children is that you try to do everything you can to impress upon them by imitation and by instruction and by love and by encouragement that they are crucial beings in the world whose ethical decisions play an important role in shaping the structure of reality itself, and that they have the moral responsibility to do that. And you get your ark in order, that's your family, let's say, so that when the storms come, you can stay above water for the 40 days of flooding, and you're capable of leading your people through the desert when the desert makes itself manifest, and you can escape from tyranny properly because you're wise enough to see it, and you take the full burden of being on yourself, all the suffering that's part and parcel of that. You accept that voluntarily, let's say, and you do everything you can to confront the malevolence that's part of you and that's part of the state and that's part of the world. And you make a garden around you. That's the paradise, a walled garden. It's a walled, well-watered place. The forces of nature and society exist together in harmony, and you place your family in that so that they can live properly. And you treat your enemy as if he's yourself, and the same with your brother. And maybe then you have the right to say that you believe in God. Otherwise, maybe you should think twice about it. You know, there's a line in the New Testament that Christ himself says. Two of them, I should read them too, because they're very relevant to this. I guess I could paraphrase them. A rich man comes up to Christ and says, good leader, good Lord. And he asks him a question about how it is that he should be a good person. And Christ says, don't call me good. There's no one that's good but God. And, you know, that's worth thinking about. I mean, the one person that in principle, in our ancient stories, had the right to make some direct connection between himself and the divine was unwilling to do it when challenged. And so it might be reasonable to assume that each of us could be much more cautious about making that sort of statement bluntly when we're asked. And then the other line is, not all those who say, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Got that about right? Which means something approximating, just because you make a claim to moral virtue, let's say, your belief in God, which I can't see how you can make a higher claim to moral virtue than that. You know, I mean, agnostic, atheistic, I don't really care. the point is something like this. Imagine something of ultimate transcendent value. I don't care whether you believe in it or not, but imagine that something like that exists. And then you swear allegiance to it, which is to say, I believe in this. I mean, there's a heavy moral burden that comes along with that, just to allow yourself to utter the words without feeling that you should be immediately struck down appropriately by lightning.